Hey guys! Tonight, we take a long, snow-dusted stroll into a nearly forgotten corner of history. A moment when Canada, our famously polite neighbor to the north, quietly drafted plans to invade the United States. Yep, you heard that right. Canada. Invasion. America. Picture it. The year is 1921. You're trudging through fresh snow in military boots that weren't designed for comfort. Your breath fogs in the air as you scan a frosted map under a dull winter sun. The plan? March into places like Seattle, Detroit, and Albany before the Americans can blink. It's not exactly something you learned in history class. And truthfully, you probably wouldn't last more than a few hours out here. The cold bites hard, the logistics are laughable, and the coffee is mostly just boiled regret. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere warm, I'm especially jealous. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a small, wood-paneled room in Ottawa. The smell of pipe tobacco lingers in the corners. A group of uniformed men leans over a giant table covered in hand-drawn maps. This isn't some casual war game or an idle afternoon at a gentleman's club. This is Defense Scheme Number 1, Canada's top-secret blueprint for what to do if America ever turned hostile. And yes, it was very real. It all started after World War I, when countries were nervously rethinking alliances and redrawing their emergency playbooks. Canada, still very much tied to Britain, worried that the next big war might involve the United States. And if that happened, they'd be in a terribly awkward spot. What if America turned on the British Empire and Canada, loyal colony that it was, got caught in the middle? So someone had the idea, what if we invaded them first? It sounds backwards, but the logic, if you squint and sip enough strong tea, was this. Canada couldn't possibly defend itself for long if war broke out with the US. The American military was bigger, richer, and mostly unfrozen year-round. So the best hope was a preemptive strike. Take a few key US cities by surprise, sabotage some railways, maybe blow up a bridge or two, then retreat back across the border before the real fighting started. Leading this icy fantasy was Lieutenant Colonel James Buster Sutherland Brown, a man whose name sounds more like a vaudeville performer than a military mastermind. But Buster took this very seriously. He and his team created Defense Scheme Number 1 in 1921. And it wasn't just a vague notion. It included exact invasion routes, army unit breakdowns, and even timelines for demolition crews. Historians still argue whether Buster truly believed the plan could work or whether it was more of a political signal, something to show Ottawa and London that Canada was thinking ahead. But either way, the plan existed. It was kept classified until 1974, when someone finally dug it out of the archives and realized Canada once dreamed of marching on Albany. Of course, there's a big difference between planning a war and actually pulling one off. This wasn't a plan that involved tanks or naval blockades. We're talking about mounted cavalry, telegraph wires, and lots of snowshoes. One stretch
even required crossing the Rockies with field artillery, not something you do before breakfast. Still, the sheer detail is oddly charming. One map includes scribbled notes about secure water supplies near Spokane. Another suggests blowing up bridges outside Detroit while avoiding civilian casualties. It's the kind of war planning you do when you know you'll probably lose, but you want to at least be clever about it. There's even a quirky footnote in the documents about potential uses for Canadian rail cars in upstate New York, assuming the Americans didn't notice the invasion before lunch. You imagine yourself bundled in a thick wool coat, trudging through Michigan farmland with a notebook, trying to figure out which bridge looks easiest to sabotage. A local farmer offers you a hot cider, and you politely decline because, well, you're technically invading. But it's not just the logistics that stand out, it's the tone. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Buster's notes have a dry, almost bemused quality, as if he's thinking, "This'll never happen, but just in case." The secrecy around the whole thing was remarkable too. Very few people knew the plan existed, and fewer still believed it would ever be used. There was no parliamentary debate, no public outcry, and certainly no newspaper editorials asking, "Should we invade Buffalo?" And yet, tucked away in a dusty drawer, the plan remained. Historians today debate whether the whole thing was really about preparing for war, or whether it was a subtle message to Britain. Don't forget, we're still loyal, and we're thinking ahead. After all, Canada was in a weird transitional phase. It had fought bravely in World War I and was beginning to see itself as more than just a British outpost. A plan like this was oddly symbolic, bold but not reckless, detailed but not deranged. There's even a persistent rumor that some Canadian officers actually drove across the border on unofficial scouting trips, noting terrain and bridge conditions while posing as tourists. One account claims they got lost in Vermont for 2 days and returned only after buying an embarrassing amount of maple syrup. That part might be apocryphal, but then again, it's hard to say what's fact and what's folklore when you're talking about Canada planning a surprise attack on Minneapolis. Still, you can't help but feel a certain warmth in the absurdity of it all. The snow crunches under your boots, the map flutters in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, a loon calls over a frozen lake. You're part of a secret, ridiculous mission that history almost forgot, but that somehow still feels oddly, sleepily real.
You're still clutching that crinkled map, the ink smudged just slightly by the damp chill in the air. The weight of this whole absurd situation presses gently against your wool-lined shoulders. You're not just a sleepy figure wandering through the wilderness. You're a would-be invader of the United States, from Canada, in the 1920s. The plan is outrageous, almost charmingly so. But don't let that fool you. Canada's military thinkers put actual effort into imagining this snowy assault. They weren't just sketching out fantasy novels over maple-glazed scones. This was a full-blown strategic initiative with actual routes, phases, and tactical goals. You look again at your assigned role. You're in the Western Division. That means your mission starts from Vancouver, one of the most scenic cities in the British Empire. Your target? Seattle. Specifically to neutralize key American infrastructure before they even finish their morning toast. That means you'll have to cross the border quickly, on horseback or by truck convoy, depending on the weather, and occupy as much territory as possible before the Americans mobilize their forces. The plan generously gives you 24 to 48 hours before U.S. reinforcements make life considerably less cozy. In theory, you'd be sweeping down through Washington state like a gentle avalanche of politeness and camouflage. Once Seattle was secure, you'd sabotage ports, bridges, and railways, just enough to disrupt any American counterattacks. Then, just as swiftly, you'd retreat back across the border, hopefully with enough ground gained to delay any U.S. incursion into British Columbia. On paper, it all reads like a bold, noble gesture. In practice, well, you've seen Canadian roads in March. Meanwhile, your fellow Canadians would be launching similar missions in the east. From Winnipeg, troops would race toward Fargo and Minneapolis. From Montreal, a separate force would push into Albany and upstate New York. If you're wondering how they planned to get through the Adirondacks in spring slush, so are historians. And still, the confidence shines through the plan. It's the strategic equivalent of bringing a snowball to a cannon fight, but darn it if they didn't believe they could land the first good throw. One of the more ambitious elements of Defense Scheme Number 1 involved blowing up key rail lines to slow the U.S. response. You imagine yourself crouched beside some steel tracks, cold wind in your face, fiddling with a fuse you only half understand. The idea was to knock out the American ability to move troops quickly across the country, buying the Canadian Army precious hours, maybe even days. But here's the catch. This wasn't just a defensive plan. Despite its awkward name, Defense Scheme Number 1 was all about offense. The idea was to launch a surprise invasion into U.S. territory without a formal declaration of war. You'd charge in, do as much logistical damage as possible, then retreat. Ideally, the British Navy would arrive in the meantime to help Canada hold the line. And that's the real twist here. The whole plan depended on the Royal Navy showing up like a well-dressed deus ex machina, sailing into the Atlantic and giving the Americans second thoughts about pushing any farther north. Historians still argue whether London had any idea what Canada was up to, or whether they would have ever sent ships at all. But Buster Brown seemed confident. Or maybe he was just good at pretending. To make the plan more palatable, Canadian leaders came up with a charming euphemism called strategic forward defense. It sounds a bit like a soccer tactic, or maybe something you do to defend your lawn from raccoons, but it really meant invade them, so we don't have to fight in Toronto.
You shuffle through the plan again, glancing at a side note labeled Phase 3 Local Pacification. That meant gently convincing any occupied towns that no, this wasn't a full invasion, and yes, Canada would leave soon. They even drafted propaganda flyers to hand out to American citizens, explaining that the attack was, quote, temporary and defensive, unquote. You almost have to admire the politeness. Of course, none of this could have been accomplished without boots on the ground. And those boots would be worn by very cold, very tired Canadian soldiers. The Canadian Army in the 1920s wasn't exactly a juggernaut. Most of its men were veterans of World War I, and while battle-tested, they weren't exactly eager to swap muddy trenches for frozen wheat fields. Still, the Canadian forces were known for their grit. One quirky detail tucked into the margins of Defense Scheme Number 1 involves training exercises using fake American road signs. In one case, a field commander built a replica of a Vermont crossroads out of cardboard and had his troops practice civility drills in case they needed to reassure confused American farmers. Whether any real American recognized the difference is lost to history. Another oddity? The plan included emergency supply caches buried just across the border. The idea was that if a Canadian unit had to retreat quickly, they could dig up food, maps, and even spare socks in small depots disguised as old hunting lodges or ranger stations. To date, none of these secret stashes have ever been confirmed, though one legend claims a hunter in Montana once found a wooden crate labeled "Canadian Army, Do Not Open" and used it as firewood. You glance toward the sunrise now, stretching out over the frosted pines. The morning is still quiet, the world still deeply asleep, unaware that a tiny sliver of history once balanced on the edge of this ridiculous idea, that Canada might save itself by becoming the world's most apologetic invader. And all of it, every last bridge, boat, and buried sock rested on surprise. The plan depended on acting quickly, striking fast, and then explaining everything very nicely after the fact. Whether it would have worked is another question, but no one can say that Canadians weren't thorough in their imagination. Your journey is just beginning. That map in your hands? It's about to lead you deeper into one of the strangest war plans never carried out. And don't worry, you're still not expected to survive a real winter campaign.
You squint at the map again. Thick red lines curling across the snow-dusted border creep downward like polite fingers. But they aren't yours. These lines are American, part of something called War Plan Red, and they paint a very different picture. While Canada had its secret Defense Scheme Number 1, the United States had its own suite of color-coded contingency plans. There was War Plan Black for Germany, Orange for Japan, and, yes, Red for the British Empire. And if things ever got really out of hand with our tea-loving cousins across the Atlantic, Crimson was the code name for Canada. So now you're imagining it from the other side. You're an American officer in 1930, standing in a smoke-filled war room in Washington, D.C., flipping through a leather-bound binder. Inside, there's an entire hypothetical playbook for invading Canada. It's detailed, it's ambitious, and it's a bit unsettling. According to War Plan Red, the U.S. strategy in the event of war with Britain would involve swiftly invading and occupying key Canadian cities: Montreal, Quebec City, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. The aim would be to cut Canada off from Britain before the Royal Navy could reinforce it. Sound familiar? It should. It's almost a mirror image of Canada's own plan. Both sides thought, better strike first before they do. You start to wonder, was this a Cold War before the Cold War? A chess match made of snow, moose tracks, and mutual suspicion? Historians still argue whether either side ever intended to act on these plans. But they were taken seriously enough to inspire actual military exercises. In the 1930s, U.S. forces ran war games that included occupying parts of Nova Scotia and setting up temporary bases near the border for training. The line between fiction and rehearsal began to blur.
One quirky moment in this frosty staring contest came in 1935, when the U.S. began building a giant airstrip in upstate New York under the official purpose of national preparedness. Canadian officials, reading between the lines, responded by increasing their budget for border defense, quietly. The more you looked, the more you realized this wasn't some isolated fantasy. It was part of a broader, nervous post-war reality. After World War I, the United States had emerged as a new global heavyweight, while Britain was still clinging to its empire. Canada, awkwardly in the middle, had one foot in each world, and that made it a potential battleground if things ever got ugly. One particularly eerie section of War Plan Red calls for the U.S. Navy to seize Halifax. Why Halifax? Well, the Americans figured that if they could take control of that vital Atlantic port, they could cut Britain's naval access and starve out any reinforcements. You imagine the scene, American troops storming Halifax's harbor, trying not to slip on the ice while locals stare in sleepy disbelief. You, hiding behind a crate of dried cod, probably wondering if this counts as a war crime or just very rude behavior. Back in Canada, Buster Brown had warned about this possibility. That's why Halifax played such a crucial role in Defense Scheme Number 1. If America moved fast enough to seize that port, the entire Canadian coast could be lost before the British even put on their boots. And here's where things get truly ironic. Both sides feared the other would act first. Both built plans around surprise invasions that were meant to prevent surprise invasions. It's like watching two neighbors point snowblowers at each other and yelling, "Don't make me clear your driveway."
This is the absurd logic of mutual suspicion. Neither side wanted war, but both wanted to be ready just in case. And yet, the plans weren't purely strategic. They also revealed some funny little assumptions. The Americans, for example, believed that Canadians wouldn't put up much resistance, maybe a few polite protests, perhaps an angry letter to the editor. There's even a line in War Plan Red suggesting that U.S. troops would be welcomed by locals seeking liberation from British rule. You chuckle at that one. Clearly someone hadn't visited rural Quebec in February. At the same time, Canadian planners assumed the U.S. would move slowly, giving just enough time for British aid to arrive. But if you've ever watched American traffic during a Black Friday sale, you know that was wildly optimistic. One peculiar note tucked into War Plan Red involves sending American forces up the Hudson River into Quebec using paddle steamers. Whether that was meant as a serious plan or someone's fever dream after a long night at the officers' club remains unclear. There was also a proposed denial strategy, destroying certain Canadian assets so the British couldn't use them either. It included sabotaging railways, ports, and factories, all in a country that was supposedly going to welcome you. Historians debate whether War Plan Red was ever updated after its initial creation. Some say it was quietly shelved as Canada became more independent in the 1930s. Others argue that elements of it were folded into early Cold War planning. Regardless, it was never officially canceled. It simply faded into obsolescence, an embarrassing relic of a time when even the friendliest neighbors carried secret blueprints for bar fights. And maybe that's what makes it so fascinating. You sit there, wrapped in your metaphorical blanket, staring out at a world that once balanced on the edge of something so improbable. A war between Canada and the United States. Two democracies, two economies deeply tied. Two cultures that, for all their differences, agree on the superiority of indoor heating. And yet, both countries built plans, carefully, secretly, sleepily, for what to do if that friendship ever cracked.
As the fire crackles softly and your boots begin to dry by the hearth, you can't help but marvel at how close it all came to being more than just a funny footnote. You stretch, yawn, and turn the page on that old yellowing binder. Up next, the truly bizarre logistics of fighting a war across thousands of miles of forest, farmland, and half-frozen lakes. But don't worry, you're still safe. For now.
You step out of the hypothetical command tent and find yourself knee-deep in snow. Not dramatic, movie-style snow, just the dense, foot-numbing kind that crunches softly under your boots and threatens to soak through the seams if you linger too long. Welcome to the part of the plan that really gets strange. How exactly were the Canadians planning to move all these troops across a winter-ravaged border? Here's where things get delightfully odd. The architects of Defense Scheme Number 1 knew that time was everything. Surprise was their greatest weapon, and honestly, one of their only weapons. They figured if they could strike hard and fast, within days, even hours, they might just cause enough disruption to delay the inevitable American response. But to do that, they needed routes. Quiet ones, back roads, frozen rivers, logging trails, places where a column of tired soldiers could sneak over the border before anyone even noticed the sound of their boots. Which brings us to the first absurdity: ice roads. You picture a Canadian officer in 1921 tapping a pencil against a map and saying, "Well, if Lake Champlain's frozen, we could walk across it." And they meant it. Frozen waterways were considered viable routes for entire divisions of soldiers, their supplies, and possibly even artillery. Because what's a little glacial instability between neighbors? Historians still argue whether Canadian brass genuinely believed frozen lakes and rivers could serve as highways, or whether they just ran out of budget to build proper infrastructure. Either way, the plan assumed a lot of favorable weather. It's one thing to drive a sleigh team across the Ottawa River. It's another to do it while being strafed by American aircraft. But remember, this was the 1920s. Aircraft were still more rickety experiment than reliable death machine. So the Canadians hoped to move fast enough that air power wouldn't be a major issue. Besides, they were banking on stealth. That's where the next tactic comes in: disguise. It wasn't all snowshoes and moose logistics. Some Canadian reconnaissance units were encouraged to conduct border scouting under the guise of ordinary civilian activity: fishing trips, logging expeditions, deliveries of mail or supplies. If someone questioned why a dozen men in uniform were standing next to a bridge in Vermont sketching support beams, the answer would have been something like, "Oh, just admiring the craftsmanship, eh?" This isn't hyperbole. There are documented instances where Canadian officers in civilian clothes crossed the border in the 1920s and 30s to gather intelligence on roads, bridges, and terrain. These weren't elite spies. They were often reservists with a decent memory and a good pair of boots. One officer reportedly returned with a full notebook, several detailed maps, and a sunburn from getting too enthusiastic with his tourist cover story. Meanwhile, movement on the American side was trickier. The U.S. border was largely undefended during peacetime. There were customs posts, sure, but no major fortifications. In fact, part of the Canadian plan relied on the sheer surprise of charging across what was essentially an unguarded fence. You imagine yourself at a sleepy border crossing in upstate New York. It's 4 a.m. A lone guard is sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped enamel mug. Then suddenly, 50 soldiers appear out of the mist, waving Canadian flags and politely asking you to step aside. You blink, mutter something about moose patrols, and call your supervisor. Timing, of course, was everything. The most ambitious piece of Defense Scheme Number 1 involved coordinating multiple prongs of invasion within the same window, something like a 3-day span.
Vancouver forces would strike Seattle. Winnipeg would push into North Dakota and Minnesota. Montreal troops would aim for Albany. Each group had a set of sabotage objectives: destroy key rail lines, burn supply depots, damage infrastructure, and then get out. They weren't expected to hold territory. They just had to make a mess.
One odd note in the plan called for demolition squads, trained specifically in the use of preset explosives for railway sabotage. But there's a fringe theory among historians that some of these squads were trained using dynamite techniques borrowed from the mining industry. And let's just say the phrase controlled detonation was taken very loosely in those days. You imagine a young sapper shivering on a frostbitten bridge outside Minneapolis, looking nervously at a too long fuse and muttering, "This'll be fine." And here's the kicker: there were no supply chains. Defense scheme number 1 had a big weakness: logistics. It assumed Canadian forces would move quickly with minimal backup and no guaranteed resupply. That meant each unit had to carry everything: rations, ammunition, medical kits, maps, and those all-important wool socks. Once inside U.S. territory, there was no resupply unless you got creative. There's an apocryphal story, never confirmed but often repeated, that one unit planned to seize a small-town American general store and use it as a forward logistics depot. The idea was to barter or requisition supplies from locals, assuming they didn't object too strongly. You picture yourself awkwardly asking a store clerk in rural Michigan if they might have any spare hardtack or rifle polish for the cause. They stare at you. You stare back. Nobody moves. Then someone offers a donut, and everything softens just a little. Somewhere in all this, you remember the moose. Yes, the moose. There's a running joke among military historians about whether Defense Scheme Number 1 ever considered using moose-drawn sleds for winter transport. No official record supports this, but it's become a tongue-in-cheek symbol of the whole endeavor's peculiar charm. Grand plans drawn in earnest, wrapped in wool and frostbite, fueled by the quiet certainty that something had to be done, even if it meant relying on frozen lakes and polite horses. As your boots crunch over the imaginary ice, you begin to understand the strange beauty of the whole thing. It wasn't just about war. It was about preparation, identity, fear, and geography. It was about a country too small to fight a giant, but too proud not to try planning for it anyway. And somewhere behind all the plans and pine trees, you can hear the distant call of bagpipes, or maybe just the wind whistling through a broken sled runner.
You shake the snow off your boots and head south, figuratively stepping into the quieter world along the Canada-US border in the 1920s. Gone are the dramatic diagrams and battle plans. Here, things are slower, sleepier, the kind of places where nothing much seems to happen, unless you're the sort of person scouting for just the right place to sneak a battalion across unnoticed. This is small-town borderland, and it's a lot quieter than you probably imagined. The border, stretching over 5,500 miles from the Atlantic to the Pacific, was famously the longest undefended international border in the world. But undefended didn't mean unimportant. In fact, Defense Scheme Number 1 relied heavily on the assumption that most of these rural communities wouldn't expect or even notice a sudden invasion. Not right away, anyway. You picture yourself walking down a sleepy street in St. John, North Dakota. The year is 1922. The most exciting thing happening this week is the church bake sale. Then one morning, a local mail carrier notices a convoy of oddly uniformed men in the distance, dragging sleds through the frozen wheat fields. He assumes it's a traveling band or a very serious curling team. He's wrong. This was the paradox of the borderlands. So open, so vast, so quiet, and yet from a military standpoint, just porous enough to be the perfect place to start a war without anyone noticing. One of the biggest quirks of the Canadian plan was just how many invasion points it considered. While major cities like Montreal and Vancouver were key launching sites, the actual crossings were often tiny towns, logging roads, or rail lines that didn't even appear on most maps. A couple of them were so obscure that today they're little more than gravel trails through thick pine. Historians still argue whether these crossings were strategically chosen for their remoteness, or just because someone in the planning office had relatives there and thought, well, I know that road. You stroll now past one such place, let's say Emerson, Manitoba. Back then it was a modest border crossing with a handful of buildings and a view of the Red River. Not exactly a fortress, but for the purposes of a secret Canadian invasion plan, just about perfect. You imagine a squad of sleepy infantry bundled in wool coats, quietly slipping through the pre-dawn fog as the town slumbers on. Then there's the railways. Canada had an extensive rail network by the 1920s, and so did the United States. And at the border, a gentle handshake of iron and timber. Trains carrying everything from coal to cream cheese moved between the two countries with minimal oversight. It was peaceful, convenient, and, if you were planning a lightning invasion, astonishingly helpful.
One fringe idea in Defense Scheme Number 1 involved seizing American trains at small border stations and using them to transport Canadian troops deeper into U.S. territory. It's never been confirmed whether this idea made it into the official draft, but if you've ever dreamed of commandeering a steam engine while wearing mittens, this might be your moment. There's even a story, likely apocryphal, about Canadian officers timing how long it took for a train to get from Fort Frances, Ontario to International Falls, Minnesota, not for travel plans, for attack plans. And it wasn't just the Canadians watching. American officials, while publicly friendly, were also keeping a subtle eye on the border. Local sheriffs reported unusual activity. Railroad companies made mental notes of new customers. And in Washington, the wheels of War Plan Red quietly turned, just in case those Canadians ever decided to stop being so Canadian. One particularly curious case involves a 1927 report from a Vermont customs officer who noted frequent visits from Canadian surveyors who always seemed very interested in local bridges. When asked why they kept coming back, one reportedly replied, "Just making sure it's still there, eh?" That's some world-class espionage right there. But perhaps the most enduring part of this whole borderland scenario is the people, the civilians, the farmers and shopkeepers and sleepy-eyed railway workers who lived their entire lives along that quiet line between nations. For them, the idea of an invasion, from Canada no less, was laughable. You picture a milkman in Buffalo looking up one morning to see a unit of mounted Canadians trotting down Main Street, apologizing for the disruption and asking if anyone had seen a working telegraph. The strange thing is, these communities often straddled the border in more than just geography. Families had members on both sides. Farmers crossed the line to sell grain or visit cousins. Church groups held joint services. A few towns even celebrated the 4th of July and Victoria Day, because why not? So the idea of those very same communities becoming battlefields, it's surreal. Historians still debate whether Canadian planners truly thought they could carry out an invasion without sparking widespread civilian panic, or whether they just hoped Americans wouldn't take it personally. You wander past another border town now, maybe Derby Line, Vermont, where the local library literally straddles the border, half in the US, half in Canada. It's a real place, a library with an international line running right through the reading room. You can imagine soldiers stepping over that line, checking out a book, and technically invading a sovereign nation. It's ridiculous, and somehow very, very real. But even in the quietest corners of this story, there's tension. Because underneath the snow and silence lies a reminder. Peace is fragile, even among friends, and sometimes the most unlikely places can find themselves in the footnotes of a nearly forgotten plan. You take a moment to sit on a bench near the ghost of a border station, listening to the soft wind and the occasional bird call. The plan never happened. The war never came. But the preparations, the maps, the briefings and boots and bridge measurements, oh, they were very real. And all of it, the secrecy, the absurdity, the strange optimism, played out in places where the biggest news most days was the arrival of the mail. You pull your scarf tighter as the imagined cold creeps in again, because now it's time to talk about spies in flannel shirts. No, not a band name, not yet anyway. These were the men sent to scout the border, disguised as lumberjacks, anglers, traveling salesmen, or, when subtlety failed, just guys who looked very confident holding maps. They weren't James Bond, they weren't even Johnny English, but in their own quiet way, they were Canada's best hope for pulling off a surprise. See, Defense Scheme Number 1 didn't rely just on military maneuvers. It required information, detailed, up-to-date information about terrain, infrastructure, and American troop activity, none of which was conveniently listed on Wikipedia in 1921. So how did they get it? They sent people. Not formally trained spies, mind you. These were usually officers, engineers, or reservists with a good sense of direction and a reasonable poker face. And they didn't slink through shadows. They took trains, rented cabins, bought sandwiches in American diners, and as they traveled, they took notes, lots of them. You imagine yourself now on one of those trips, dressed in plaid, your boots dusty, your cover story carefully memorized. I'm just here to fish for pike. Heard the bite's good this time of year. Meanwhile, your pockets are full of scribbled notes about local road widths, bridge supports, and how many minutes it takes to drive from one small town to another. One officer, according to declassified records, made his way through Vermont posing as a vacationer. He carried a field journal disguised as a Bible, which he used to record bridge weight limits and troop movement potential. At night, he sketched maps by lantern light in a rented barn. Another story, less confirmed, but too good not to mention, involves a pair of surveyors who spent 3 weeks in upstate New York taking soil samples they claimed were for scientific research. Their samples were never analyzed, but they returned to Ottawa with a full breakdown of railway access points and road quality after a heavy thaw. Historians still argue whether these men were true spies or simply scouts under a different name. The line, like the border, was blurry. What's clear is that this reconnaissance work was vital to the plan. Without accurate, first-hand knowledge of American infrastructure, Defense Scheme Number 1 would have been even more of a shot in the dark than it already was. These men didn't just walk the walk, they measured it, rated its traction, and estimated how many horses it would take to move artillery through it. It was espionage by way of hiking trip. And not without risks. Being caught as a foreign national taking suspicious notes near a bridge, that could land you in real trouble. One story from the archives mentions a Canadian officer detained in Maine for loitering near the railway switchyard. He was released after claiming he was just fascinated by locomotives. Whether the Americans believed him or just found the story too charming to pursue is lost to time. You pause now on an imaginary trail, pine needles soft underfoot, and think about what it must have been like, spying not out of thrill or ideology, but out of quiet obligation. No gadgets, no escape plans, just a good memory, a steady hand, and a face that looked like it belonged there. And this wasn't happening in isolation.
While Canadian scouts wandered the states, American agents were quietly doing the same up north. In fact, part of War Plan Red included its own intelligence-gathering missions. American officers mapped Canadian towns, rail depots, and coastal forts with equal diligence. There's a certain symmetry in that. Two neighbors casually peeking over the fence at each other's garden sheds, both pretending not to notice. One odd tidbit? There's evidence the Canadian military used mail carriers and rail conductors as informal sources of information. These were people who regularly crossed into the U.S., often unnoticed, and could report back about any unusual troop movements, construction, or even road conditions. It was military intelligence by mail route. You can't help but smile at the idea of a mustachioed postman unknowingly shaping the fate of hypothetical international conflict with an offhand comment like, "Well, the bridge at Holton looks a bit dodgy this spring." Then there's the role of local knowledge. Defense Scheme Number 1 leaned heavily on the idea that Canadians living near the border would know the terrain better than anyone. Small-time farmers, trappers, and lumber workers were seen as a kind of organic intelligence network. Some documents even suggest tapping local knowledge in real time during any future conflict, essentially asking for directions while marching into enemy territory. It's not exactly high-tech espionage, but it's very Canadian. Still, this homespun spy network was built on a foundation of nerves, because all of it,
every single reconnaissance trip had to remain secret. If the Americans found out what Canada was planning, the element of surprise would vanish. And that wasn't just inconvenient, that was the end of the whole plan. So every fake fishing license, every innocent-seeming question about bridge repairs carried weight. The flannel shirt might have been warm, but it wasn't bulletproof. You continue along the trail, real or imagined, and listen to the wind in the trees. It's easy to forget now how much effort went into these quiet missions. No headlines, no medals. Just ink on maps passed along by men who said little, remembered much, and blended in perfectly. It's the kind of story that fades easily. Too odd to be taught in school, too soft to be called a spy thriller, and too earnest to laugh at. But it happened. And in the dark corners of a filing cabinet, somewhere deep in Ottawa, there are probably still maps marked in pencil, tiny notes in the margins reading things like "Road muddy past Elm Creek, watch axle height." A war never came. The plans were never used, but the footprints of those spies, worn into back roads, border towns, and broken pine, remain in the quiet spaces of a world that once almost needed them.
Your boots crunch across the gravel of a harbor, the salty Atlantic wind tugging at your coat. You've followed the imaginary invasion inland and across the border, but now it's time to head east, to the coastal city of Halifax, Nova Scotia. A place with deep waters, deep history, and even deeper strategic value. Because if Defense Scheme Number 1 was Canada's plan for an unlikely invasion of the United States, then Halifax was the hinge on which that entire plan swung. You picture it now, a cold dawn rising over Halifax Harbor, seagulls wheeling lazily overhead, the scent of salt and coal smoke hanging in the air. Fishing boats bob in the water, unaware, or perhaps just uninterested, that in the minds of a few Canadian generals, this peaceful harbor could become the most important military asset in the country. See, Halifax wasn't just a port, it was the port. Canada's most important naval hub, its gateway to the Atlantic, and in theory, the place where the British Royal Navy would come to Canada's aid if the Americans ever came knocking. In the event of war, everything depended on Halifax staying in Canadian hands. And that wasn't guaranteed, because the Americans, clever and cautious as ever, had noticed Halifax too. In War Plan Red, the U.S. strategy for dealing with the British Empire, Halifax was listed as one of the top objectives. Their thinking was simple. If you could knock out Halifax early, you'd isolate Canada, keep the British Navy out of the picture, and break the whole invasion game before it even started. And so Defense Scheme Number 1 wasn't just about crossing the border into Vermont or Minnesota. It was about not losing Halifax, not letting the Americans beat you to your own back door. The plan? Make it as hard as possible for the U.S. to land troops there. That meant fortifying coastal defenses, laying mines, and relying heavily on whatever ships and artillery could be scraped together. Canada's Navy at the time was, well, modest would be a polite word. A few cruisers, some aging destroyers, and a handful of support vessels. It wasn't much, but it was what they had. Historians still argue whether Britain ever seriously committed to defending Halifax in case of a U.S. invasion. Some believe it was an unspoken promise. Others suggest Canada might have been left to fend for itself while Britain handled bigger imperial concerns elsewhere. The ambiguity made Halifax even more critical. If help might come, you'd better be ready to hold out until it does. So you step now into the mind of a Halifax commander in 1925. You've been told to prepare the city for the possibility of sudden attack by sea, land, or air. You don't have many men, you don't have many guns, but you do have cliffs, fog, stubbornness, and the weight of national survival on your shoulders. Your mission is to delay, to buy time, and maybe, if you're lucky, to stay just under the radar. One odd quirk of the plan involved not looking too fortified. There was concern that visibly preparing Halifax for war would provoke suspicion in Washington. So defense upgrades had to be subtle, quietly training gunners, improving harbor patrols, stockpiling coal for the naval vessels without drawing too much attention. It's the military equivalent of nervously buttoning your coat in front of someone and saying, "No, everything's fine. Just a little chilly, that's all." And then there is Citadel Hill.
If you've never seen it, picture a great star-shaped fortress right in the heart of Halifax, overlooking the harbor like a sleepy sentinel. It had stood there since the 1700s, used during British colonial wars, but by the 1920s, it was more of a museum piece than an active defense post. Still, under Defense Scheme Number 1, it would have been reactivated, its old gun positions refurbished, its walls remanned, and its underground passages filled again with the scent of oil, gunpowder, and anticipation. One chilling detail? Planners discussed preparing fallback demolition points, bridges, docks, even entire sections of the city, just in case retreat became necessary. If Halifax fell, the goal was to deny the Americans anything useful. In the worst case, the port would be rendered unusable, at least until the British could fight their way back to reclaim it. You pause now on a quiet bluff overlooking the Atlantic. The sea is calm, but in your imagination, warships bob on the horizon, distant silhouettes in the mist. Would they be British reinforcements or American landing craft? The tension in that uncertainty shaped everything. It shaped the structure of Canadian forces in the East, shaped budget debates in Ottawa, shaped the urgency with which engineers reinforced key docks and rail lines, sometimes under false pretexts like weatherproofing or infrastructure modernization. And it shaped Halifax itself. This city, known for its lighthouses, lobsters, and longshoremen, also held the delicate title of Imperial Lifeline. If it fell, Canada might be cut off from Britain for good. The plan was to hold it, fortified quietly, and trust that no one would ever find out why those harbor patrols suddenly got more regular in the late 1920s. One historian, writing about the whole affair decades later, described Halifax in this period as a city quietly preparing for a war it prayed would never come. And you can feel that, can't you? The stillness, the restraint, the low thrum of readiness under the rhythms of daily life. You walk through the imagined streets now, past fishmongers, bundled children, coal workers with blackened hands, and realize that most of them had no idea. No idea that in carefully folded government files, their city was marked in red ink, primary target. No idea that Canadian officers had practiced emergency evacuations in secret drills. No idea that foreign spies, possibly American, might have walked these docks too, making quiet notes about tides, depth, and vulnerability. Halifax wasn't just a city, it was a pressure point, a fuse. One bad decision from either side, and it could have been the first domino in a war neither country really wanted, but both quietly prepared for. But tonight, it's peaceful. The sea rolls on. The citadel stands. The plan was made, filed, and forgotten. And you? You're just a sleepy time traveler with a wool cap and a thermos of imaginary tea, watching the fog roll in over a city that never became a battlefield, but very nearly did.
Your breath comes slower now as you follow the most daring of all the imaginary roads, not away from Canada, but straight into the United States. Past the birch trees and quiet border stations, past the frozen rivers and polite misdirections. You're not scouting anymore, you're invading. Because this is the phase where the plan, Defense Scheme Number 1, unfolds into its boldest chapter, a coordinated military strike into American territory. On paper, it looked almost elegant. 3 major thrusts, each aimed like the sharp tip of a bayonet, one from the west, one from the center, and one from the east. If you trace them on the map, they form a kind of crooked W, and right now, you're walking the eastern arm. You begin in Montreal, the largest city in Canada at the time, humming with industry and burdened with responsibility. Troops, supplies, and rail cars gather in the shadows. The Eastern Force has its sights on New York State, specifically Albany. Yes, that Albany. The logic behind this particular move is oddly specific. Albany wasn't just a city, it was a key railway junction. In the 1920s, railroads were lifelines, and Albany was the knot in the cord. If Canadian forces could seize it, they could paralyze a whole swath of northeastern logistics. You imagine it now, a chilly train pulling out of Montreal, packed not with tourists, but with men in uniform. They're nervous, underfed, carrying rifles, dynamite, and heavy coats. As they cross the invisible line between Quebec and northern New York, the mission begins, not with a bang, but with a jolting lurch of steel wheels on rail. It's all happening quickly, as planned. Speed was everything. The troops had 24 to 48 hours to wreak havoc. They weren't expected to hold ground, only to disrupt, destroy, and withdraw, like a military flash flood. And what about the middle prong? That force departs from Winnipeg, striking south into North Dakota and Minnesota. The idea is to push hard toward Fargo and Minneapolis, targeting key bridges and communication hubs. There's a charming, if questionable, optimism about this maneuver, as if a handful of Canadian divisions might navigate icy prairie roads, demolish critical rail lines, and still make it home in time for supper. But the most ambitious route, without question, is the western push. Troops from Vancouver and nearby posts are ordered to descend upon Seattle. Yes, Seattle. You picture it, a column of vehicles, horses, and soldiers rolling through the thick forests of British Columbia, crossing into Washington State like a grumpy parade. Their goal? Disrupt port activity, seize the rail yards, and sabotage the naval facilities, all before the Americans knew what hit them. One fringe document even includes a footnote about trying to disable or delay American submarines stationed near Bremerton, as if you could just roll up with a couple of engineers and say, "Hey fellas, we're going to need those torpedoes offline if you don't mind." It's here, somewhere between ambition and delusion, that the plan wobbles the most. Historians still argue whether Canadian military brass truly believed this would work, or if it was always just about making a mess and buying time. After all, the moment the Americans recovered from the shock, the numbers wouldn't be in Canada's favor.
But the sheer scope of the plan remains staggering. We're talking about advancing hundreds of kilometers into foreign territory with limited resupply, sketchy infrastructure, and winter breathing down your neck. And doing it all without triggering total panic or international condemnation. That's a tall order. And yet, they prepared for it. Units were assigned roads, maps were hand-marked, field kits were packed, communications codes were drafted. One particularly quaint document includes instructions for handling American civilians. Maintain calm and discourage resistance. Do not provoke unless provoked. You can practically hear the imagined officer saying, "Excuse me, ma'am, sorry to occupy your backyard. We'll only be a minute." Let's not forget the demolitions teams. These were specially trained squads whose job it was to blow up bridges, rail lines, power stations, anything useful to the U.S. war machine. You picture a small group of tired soldiers crouched beneath a wooden trestle at 3 a.m., setting charges by lantern light and trying not to sneeze. And some of the targets, surprisingly strategic. In New York State, the plan included attempts to disable electric plants supplying downstate cities. In Minnesota, the goal was to disrupt grain shipments headed for Chicago. In Seattle, the objective was to stall coastal shipping long enough for the Royal Navy to show up, assuming, of course, it ever did. You walk past these imaginary craters now, these railway tracks bent into useless loops by controlled charges. Each one a small, desperate attempt to stall a country 10 times your size. Not conquer it, not humiliate it, just slow it down long enough for the tide to shift. Because, remember, this plan was never about winning. It was about buying time. That's why none of the Canadian prongs were expected to hold ground permanently. The whole scheme depended on rapid withdrawals, melting back across the border before the American counterattack arrived. It's not unlike throwing snowballs at a bear and then sprinting back to your den, hoping the bear pauses long enough to tie its boots. There's something oddly noble about it. Ridiculous, yes, but noble. And of course, there were alternate routes. What if a key road washed out? What if rail lines were already cut? Planners built in contingencies, gravel side roads, frozen lake crossings, even canoe portages in a few cases. You picture an entire military unit portaging artillery across the Adirondacks like some cursed Boy Scout troop. There's a strange, snowy poetry to it all. The plan was big, bold, and built on a fantasy of timing, stealth, and sheer audacity. And the most Canadian part, the moment the troops crossed back into Canada, after all the sabotage was done, they were instructed to prepare defensive positions. That's right. As soon as you were done invading, you were expected to dig in and defend your home turf from the inevitable return fire. Because at the end of the day, defense scheme number 1 wasn't about conquest. It was about survival. And maybe a little revenge for the War of 1812. But mostly survival. As you trudge back along the imagined trails of retreat, you can almost hear the distant rumble of American engines revving up in the south. Because the real counterattack, it's still to come. But for now, you've seen the full reach of Canada's boldest, frostiest military fantasy. And all you can do is whisper to yourself, well, that escalated politely.
You pause in your snowy march now, just for a moment, and tilt your head, not toward Canada, but southward.
Because while the Canadians were busy drawing up hand-labeled invasion maps and training demolition squads with mining gear, the Americans weren't exactly sipping tea and humming Sousa marches. They had their own plans, and they were big. War Plan Red, drafted in the 1930s, was the U.S. military's comprehensive strategy for war with the British Empire. You've heard that already. But what you may not know is just how detailed and how eerily practical it really was. And yes, the Canadians were the first domino. You're standing now in a training field in Massachusetts, squinting at a line of tents flapping in the wind. Soldiers in blue-gray fatigues hustle through early morning drills. What are they preparing for? A theoretical war with the British. But where would that war start? Right on the 49th parallel. War Plan Red's Crimson Annex focused specifically on Canada. It included exact crossing points, expected resistance, and a full breakdown of Canadian infrastructure. The idea was simple. If Britain ever turned hostile, Canada would be its staging ground, so America needed to seize it, quickly and decisively. You might find that odd, given the famously cozy Canada-US relationship today. But back then, Britain was still an empire. America was still suspicious. And the Monroe Doctrine wasn't just bedtime reading, it was the rule book. So the U.S. began to prepare. And by prepare, we don't mean drafting a dusty binder and calling it a day. We're talking real training exercises, red versus blue war games, naval patrols, even infrastructure tweaks designed with the Canadian border in mind. In 1935, for instance, the U.S. built an enormous airstrip in upstate New York that some historians believe was intended as a forward base for Canadian operations. Conveniently placed, quietly funded, officially listed under routine preparedness, of course. One real field exercise held in Vermont in the mid-1930s had American troops simulating a rapid advance into Quebec. The stated goal? Establishing forward operating security against northern threats. You read that and can't help but imagine an officer raising an eyebrow, knowing full well what northern threats meant. In fact, many of these drills used color-coded units, blue for America, red for the British Empire, and crimson for Canada. It sounds like a children's board game until you remember these were real men training for a hypothetical war that was supposed to feel entirely possible. And let's be clear, America wasn't playing defense. While Canada's defense scheme number 1 was all about striking first to buy time, War Plan Red assumed that the United States would be the aggressor. In the event of rising tensions, Washington's plan was to launch a massive, coordinated invasion into Canadian territory. Montreal would be taken, Halifax occupied, Vancouver, if possible, blockaded or bombed. It gets more unnerving the deeper you read. One section of the plan recommended seizing Canadian industrial centers and converting them into U.S. supply hubs. Another called for placing loyalist officials in charge of occupied territories to ensure cooperation. Historians still argue whether this part was sincere preparation or just bureaucratic boilerplate, but the fact that it was written at all, that speaks volumes. You walk now along an imagined military camp outside Detroit. American tanks idle, their engines coughing plumes of black smoke. Soldiers joke quietly about winter gear. They're told to expect light resistance crossing into Ontario. Some believe they'll be greeted as liberators. Sound familiar? It should. That exact assumption appeared in both War Plan Red and its follow-ups. Canadian morale was described as moderate, and local resistance was deemed unlikely to be sustained without British reinforcement. You smile dryly. Clearly, they'd never met a prairie farmer with a rifle and a grudge. There were, of course, flaws. One of the biggest, terrain. The U.S. Army underestimated just how miserable Canadian geography could be. Long exposed supply lines, impassable lakes, and snow. So much snow. Canadian winters weren't just inconvenient, they were weaponized. You imagine now a convoy stuck outside Thunder Bay, snow piling up against the treads, an American sergeant staring blankly at a map and muttering, "Where even is Sudbury?" And then there's the issue of timing. Unlike Canada's plan, which aimed to retreat quickly, War Plan Red required a sustained occupation. Troops would have to hold territory, set up administration, and maintain control while waiting for British retaliation. That meant months or even years of boots on icy ground. The plan included long-term projections, how to feed occupying forces, how to handle civilian unrest, even how to monitor Canadian newspapers for anti-American sentiment. One memo suggested creating friendly media partnerships in captured cities to ease the transition. Nothing says liberation like gently censoring the local classifieds. Perhaps the strangest part? The secrecy wasn't perfect. By the late 1930s, parts of War Plan Red had been leaked or whispered about. Canadian officials, while never formally responding, almost certainly knew. And that knowledge likely influenced continued updates to Defense Scheme Number 1. It became a slow-motion arms race of hypothetical proportions. Neither country wanted war, but both seemed to be wading chest-deep into the chilly waters of just in case. So here you are, standing in the quiet shadows between two strategies. One planned to strike and retreat, the other to invade and hold. And all of it, every drill, every redacted memo, every snow-choked convoy, was part of a secret game played just out of sight of ordinary citizens. A paper war played by men in thick coats with sharp pencils. Tonight, the fields are empty. The plans are shelved. The borders are quiet. But for a brief moment, history nearly had a much frostier chapter. And you've walked both sides of it now. Just remember to zip up that jacket. It gets cold in the hypotheticals.
You turn now from marching armies and field drills to something altogether quieter and somehow more complicated. Diplomacy. You've seen the maps, the spies, the backcountry trails marked for sabotage. But here's the funny thing. All of it, the entire frostbitten fantasy of a Canada-US conflict, was unfolding beneath a blanket of diplomatic politeness so thick you could use it as insulation. Because while generals scribbled plans to cross the border with rifles and dynamite, the politicians, they were shaking hands and smiling for the cameras. You step into the smoky wood-paneled offices of Ottawa sometime in the mid-1920s. The air smells like pipe tobacco and parliamentary carpet. Newspapers on the desk talk of trade agreements, fishing disputes, and British royal tours. Not war, not sabotage, certainly not full-on invasion. But that disconnect? That's the whole story. The relationship between Canada and the United States in this period was complicated. On the surface, it was calm. Two massive democracies, side by side, with growing economies and increasingly shared interests. But underneath, a tangle of historical grievances, economic competition, and colonial hangovers. And the biggest issue of all? Britain. Canada was still a dominion, not fully independent, not entirely sovereign, a grown-up child of the empire still seated at the family table. And in the eyes of the United States, especially the more hawkish factions in Washington, that meant Canada wasn't just Canada. It was British, and that made it a potential threat. You can almost hear the quiet conversations between American diplomats spoken through clenched smiles. Yes, we like the Canadians, but if push comes to shove, can we trust them not to follow London? That's what made War Plan Red plausible. The assumption wasn't that Canada would turn hostile on its own. It was that Canada might be forced into hostility, dragged into a British-American war like a younger sibling clutching a backpack full of bad decisions. Canadian leaders knew this perception existed, and they walked a delicate line to manage it. Publicly, they spoke warmly of their American neighbors. Privately? Well, that's why Defense Scheme Number 1 was developed behind so many locked doors. It's a curious kind of political theater, both countries smiling across the table while secretly wondering how fast the other could mobilize artillery. There's one peculiar moment in 1927 that illustrates this contradiction perfectly. Canadian and American officials met to resolve a long-standing dispute over fishing rights in the North Atlantic. The talks were friendly, at least on the surface. But according to archival notes from a Canadian advisor, just 2 days before the meeting, he had reviewed sections of Defense Scheme Number 1 outlining hypothetical troop movements through Maine. Fish on Monday, invasion routes on Sunday. That was the dance. And Washington wasn't innocent either. Several Canadian politicians grew increasingly nervous in the early 1930s when they noticed American budget allocations for northern defense infrastructure. In simpler terms, roads that led to the Canadian border upgraded for logistics efficiency. Historians still argue whether these were routine projects or quietly strategic positioning in case of war. The language in the budget was vague. On purpose, probably. Then there was the matter of intelligence sharing, or lack thereof.
By the 1930s, both countries were aware of each other's hypothetical war plans, at least in broad strokes, but neither formally acknowledged them. It was a Cold War-style détente decades before the Cold War even existed. No direct confrontation, just quiet maneuvering and careful avoidance of any topic that might bring those secret maps into the light. One Canadian official described the relationship in his diary as two neighbors maintaining the appearance of absolute cordiality while building fences no one wants to admit are there. You wander now into the halls of Parliament in Ottawa. Politicians give speeches about trade, immigration, and domestic growth. No mention of the fact that just 3 floors below, military staff are updating estimates on how long it would take to sabotage the rail bridge outside Buffalo. Likewise, you stroll through Washington, D.C., where congressional hearings cover tariffs and prohibition, but behind closed doors, Someone's asking the Navy if they've considered Halifax's harbor depth in case of unexpected Atlantic operations. And of course, there were the journalists. Every now and then, a stray article would appear in some regional paper. U.S. military drills near border raise eyebrows, or Canadian troops spotted on fishing expedition in Vermont. These tidbits were always quickly dismissed, laughed off, explained away. Just training, just a drill, just curious Canadians admiring American bridges. You sit now on a quiet bench in a border town like Stansted or Sault Ste. Marie. The wind carries the sound of a harmonica from somewhere across the street. On one side of the road, Canada. On the other, the U.S. And between them, an invisible line, thin as a pencil stroke, easy to cross on foot, difficult to erase with history. And that's the quiet truth of it. Neither country wanted war. That's important to remember. The plans weren't signs of aggression. They were signs of anxiety. A shared uncertainty about the world after World War I, about alliances, about empires shifting and collapsing, and about how to prepare for a future no one could predict. So the politicians smiled, and the generals planned, each in their own space, rarely colliding, but always aware of the other's shadow. It's not betrayal, it's not paranoia, it's just geopolitics in a cardigan. Because underneath every handshake in Ottawa or Washington, there was a quiet mental calculation. What if? And just in case, someone made sure the file cabinets were locked. You glance down at your own imaginary set of keys, not to start the war, just to understand it. Or at least, the strange, sleepy moment when Canada and the United States, two friendly giants, very nearly prepared to shake hands with one and slap with the other.
You walk now through snowdrifts, thick with contradiction, because we're entering the strangest chapter of Defense Scheme Number 1, the part where it tried to make war look like peace. This was no conventional plan of conquest. Remember, Canada didn't want to occupy the United States. It wanted to delay it, confuse it, slow it down long enough for someone in London to rub their eyes, put down their tea, and say, "Ah, yes, better send the fleet." But here's the twist. The plan wasn't just to strike first. It was to make that strike look defensive. Yes, you invade first, but make it look like they started it. You're standing in a small field office now, somewhere in Ottawa, where a handful of military officers in wool uniforms are hunched over a typewriter. They're not drafting orders. They're writing justifications. Because if Canadian troops were going to charge into Vermont, they'd better have a good story ready. One that sounded defensive, legal even, preferably involving some form of provocation, real, imagined, or conveniently misunderstood. That's where this plan veers fully into the surreal. The idea wasn't new. Defensive offense had been floated as a tactic since at least the 19th century. But Canada's spin on it was bold in its subtlety. Buster Brown and his team envisioned the attack as an unfortunate necessity, like a neighbor borrowing your snowblower without asking because he heard you might use it first. One memo unearthed years later outlined the preferred messaging in case the plan ever went live. All military activity is to be framed as preemptive defense against imminent threat or unauthorized U.S. troop concentrations near the border. You imagine a Canadian press conference now, hastily arranged at the edge of a battlefield. Good afternoon. Yes, our forces have occupied Albany, but only as a precaution. We assure you we'll be returning it shortly. The phrase, "make it look defensive," wasn't just a side note. It was baked into the strategy. All routes were chosen with plausible deniability in mind. All objectives were temporary. No flags planted, no declarations of dominion, just a quick poke in the ribs, a tripped supply line, and then a polite sprint back to the homeland. Historians still argue whether anyone truly believed this non-aggressive aggression would work. Would the Americans buy it? Probably not. But maybe the international community would hesitate. Maybe Britain could stall the U.S. in the League of Nations while negotiations flared up like a winter fireplace. A small window, just wide enough to crawl through. One of the oddest elements of this defensive invasion policy was the plan to bring leaflets. Yes, leaflets. Canadian forces were expected to carry printed material to distribute in U.S. towns they passed through, explaining that the incursion was temporary, defensive, and not a declaration of war. You imagine it now, a sleepy upstate New Yorker peeking out the window, seeing foreign troops tramping through town only to find a small piece of paper tucked into the mailbox that reads, "Your safety is important to us. We apologize for the inconvenience. Canada will withdraw shortly." It sounds like something you'd find on a hotel pillow, alongside a mint and an apology for the warm water pressure. But that wasn't the only planned gesture of good faith.
The invading forces were instructed, at least unofficially, to avoid civilian casualties and minimize property damage. "We're not here to burn barns," one officer wrote in the margin of his notes. "We're here to unplug the toaster, then leave." There were even informal guidelines for interactions with local Americans. Do not engage unless fired upon. Do not seize personal property unless required for mission survival. Be courteous whenever possible. This wasn't just war, it was apologetic war. You pause now in a quiet, snow-covered street in rural Vermont, imagination, of course, and picture a scene straight out of this absurd plan. A line of Canadian troops moving quickly but quietly, a few stopping to help clear a car stuck in a snowbank. One nods to the local shopkeeper and leaves behind a flyer. The shopkeeper reads it with squinting disbelief and mutters, "What in the maple-flavored hell?" But here's where things get murky. Because even if the Canadians acted like peacekeepers, the optics were always going to be complicated. Once you cross someone's border with rifles and demolition teams, the polite veneer starts to slip. And Buster Brown knew that. He wasn't a fool. So the fallback plan? Retreat quickly, reinforce border defenses, and deny everything. Seriously. Another segment of the plan included prepared statements and internal memos instructing Canadian officials to immediately claim misunderstanding if the invasion triggered full-scale war. We were acting under the belief that an attack was imminent. We misunderstood American intentions. We regret the escalation. There was even a vague backup hope that international law might allow for some gray area interpretation. That if no war had been declared and no American cities were permanently occupied, maybe the whole thing could be talked out. Like returning a borrowed lawnmower after accidentally mowing half your neighbor's yard and hoping they just shrug. You walk now through the ruins of this hypothetical media strategy. Imagine the headlines in the New York Times 1926.
Canadian troops occupy Albany in temporary defensive measure. Ottawa denies invasion, cites misinterpreted winter maneuvers. Leaflets dropped, maple cookies shared. It sounds ridiculous, but it was real. That blend of serious planning and surreal logic was exactly what made Defense Scheme Number 1 so Canadian. Cautious aggression, civilized chaos, war with a side of plausible deniability. You step through the mist of these never-issued orders and realize just how fragile the line between peace and conflict really was. One provocation, one misread patrol, one jittery border guard, and the whole polite fiction could have crumbled. But it didn't. The plan remained sealed, the leaflets unprinted, the apologies unspoken. And somewhere, deep in the archives, the phrase, "make it look defensive," is still tucked into a dusty folder. Waiting.
Your boots leave crisp prints now in snow not yet trampled by theory or soldiers, because we've arrived at a part of the plan that never made the headlines, or the leaflets, or even the more dramatic whispers. The landscape itself. The raw, messy, glorious, unforgiving terrain that stood between Canada and any hope of pulling this plan off without losing half its army to mud, frostbite, or bears. This war wasn't going to be fought on flat, paved roads with welcome signs and generous shoulders. No. This was a war through forests, over rivers, across frozen lakes, past moose, and sometimes straight through somebody's cabbage farm. Let's start with the West. If you're part of the western prong of the plan, assigned to invade Washington State from Vancouver, you've got a beautiful view and an absolute logistical nightmare. The Rocky Mountains stand between you and your American targets, dressed in winter snow and utterly indifferent to your artillery schedule. Historians still argue whether anyone in the planning office truly believed a force could cross the mountains swiftly enough to reach Seattle before the Americans noticed. There are notes suggesting the use of rail lines and secondary roads, but nothing can change the fact that the geography is, shall we say, aggressively inconvenient. One forgotten proposal involved using frozen rivers as improvised highways. The Fraser River, for instance, was mapped with the hopeful phrase, "may support sleigh transport if weather permits." That's not exactly a confidence booster when you're relying on an entire battalion and a couple of wagons not falling through the ice. And don't even get started on the Cascades. You imagine a small detachment of Canadian troops standing at the foot of a mountain trail, staring upward in bitter silence. One private coughs. Another mutters, "So, who packed the climbing gear?" Now shift to the Central Front. Troops launching from Winnipeg into the Dakotas in Minnesota had one advantage: flatter terrain. Unfortunately, that advantage came bundled with a few less appealing features, like open plains with no cover, blizzards, and mud that could eat a truck whole. The prairies are beautiful. They are also, in spring, a soggy mess. Canadian planners knew that if they didn't move quickly before the thaw, their troops could get bogged down in a sea of brown sludge. That meant an incredibly narrow window, less than 2 weeks by some estimates, to push south and complete sabotage missions before the elements pushed back. There's an amusingly tragic line in one margin note from a field report. Bridge outside Pembina unlikely to hold weight of armored transport if thaw accelerates. Recommend alternate crossing or pack extra boots. You picture the scene, a unit huddled around a bridge that's now underwater, scratching their heads while trying to reroute themselves through a field currently occupied by one very judgmental-looking cow. And then, of course, we have the East. The Eastern push, from Quebec into upstate New York and Vermont, was in some ways the most feasible. The terrain was dense with forests, but at least not mountainous. Still, these were old logging roads, winding and muddy, prone to becoming unusable with a bit of rain or, more likely, late snow. Canadian officers marked possible routes on 1910-era road maps with hopeful circles and penciled notations like potential detour if conditions favorable, which is code for "we hope this isn't a swamp again this year."
Add to that the challenge of coordinating demolition operations along key rail junctions, and you've got soldiers racing through unfamiliar territory, trying to beat trains to the tracks they're supposed to blow up. There's something farcical about imagining a demolition squad panting toward a rail bridge, only to hear the distant chug of an oncoming freight train and shout, "We are very much out of time." Terrain didn't just complicate the movement of troops, it limited communication. This was an era before reliable radio contact in the field. Much of the coordination would have depended on telegraph lines, hand-delivered orders, or runners. Runners through snow, through hostile territory, possibly being chased by confused American dogs. Another overlooked obstacle? Language. The Eastern Front was largely Francophone. The moment they crossed the border into Vermont and New York, French-speaking soldiers would find themselves giving orders in a region where the average civilian might not know bonjour from barrage. Not a crisis, but certainly a moment of confusion during a rushed, please don't resist, we're only here briefly encounter. Some historians have speculated that Quebecois troops might have used that very language barrier to their advantage, by confusing American locals long enough to plant explosives and withdraw before anyone called the sheriff. That's the kind of war this was shaping up to be, one where the biggest advantage wasn't superior firepower, but knowing where the ditches were too deep to drive through. Then there's the animals. Oh yes, the moose, deer, and the occasional wandering black bear. If you think war planners accounted for them, you'd be wrong. But soldiers stationed along the border often did. There's a quiet story passed down in a Manitoba regiment about a scouting mission that ended early because a mother moose refused to leave the trail and, according to the patrol's report, looked like she meant it. You smile at the idea of a small detachment waiting politely for a giant herbivore to pass so they can resume their surprise attack. That's Canadian warfare for you. Ultimately, geography was the great equalizer. While the U.S. had more men, more factories, more everything, they still had to deal with the same mountains, rivers, and forests if they wanted to push north. And Canadian planners knew this. That's why so much of Defense Scheme Number 1 depended on terrain, using it, manipulating it, and hoping it would slow the Americans as much as it might slow their own retreating troops. You sit now on the edge of an imagined bluff overlooking a bend in the river.
the trees heavy with snow, and you realize something profound in its simplicity. No matter how clever your plan is, nature has the final say. You can train a soldier to climb. You can teach them to shoot, but you can't argue with a mountain, or a thaw, or a road that, as of this morning, simply doesn't exist anymore. So, as the imagined war grinds its boots into muddy ruts and broken sled runners, you look around and understand the real enemy wasn't always going to be America. Sometimes it was the weather.
You trudge now from the frost-bitten woods and shaky bridges into a much warmer battlefield. Paper. You've walked the forests, traced the invasion routes, and stood in the imagined shadow of Citadel Hill. But here, in a room full of typewriters, carbon copies, and overworked junior officers, another kind of war was being waged. The bureaucratic one. Because Defense Scheme Number 1 wasn't just bold, it was exhaustively detailed. On paper, at least. You step into a government office in Ottawa, probably sometime in late 1923. The walls are beige, the lighting bleak, and the only thing louder than the ticking clock is the quiet clatter of forms being filed, maps being drawn, and memos being stamped. A curious silence, considering you're standing in the heart of Canada's hypothetical military juggernaut. This is where the war was outlined, rehearsed, revised, and retyped. Not in hushed command tents or on roaring battlefields, but in policy rooms filled with men arguing over whether supply wagons should be packed with condensed milk or hardtack. And let's be honest, these plans weren't sleek. They weren't top-secret dossiers bound in leather with color-coded tabs. Many were handwritten, scribbled, annotated in the margins by sleep-deprived colonels, wondering if they'd be held responsible for suggesting an entire battalion cross the Appalachians in February. There's a peculiar beauty in how bureaucratic the whole operation was. Page after page of troop assignments, estimated travel times, fuel consumption projections, lists of critical rail junctions with notes like, sabotage if possible, only with clear exit route. You picture a wearied officer rubbing his temples as he rereads the line, maximum delay ideal, minimum attention desirable. Which is the Canadian way, really. Cause just enough damage to inconvenience, never enough to offend. One of the more peculiar forms, unearthed decades later from a military archive, was titled Timetable for Emergency Withdrawal Operations, Provisional. It outlined how long it should take for each regional unit to conduct its sabotage mission, retreat northward, and establish a defensive line. You can almost hear the sleep-deprived officer saying, "We'll invade Buffalo at dawn, destroy the rail yards by tea, and be back across the border before anyone files a protest." Historians still argue whether this extreme level of paperwork was due to military diligence or simply Canada's love of process. One thing is clear, for a plan that was never meant to be used, it sure was written like it might be needed tomorrow. There's also something comically earnest about some of the fringe entries. A document titled Notes on Possible Use of Bicycles in Eastern Terrain included a table comparing average soldier cycling speeds with local road conditions. It concluded, somewhat defeatedly, that use of bicycles inadvisable during spring thaw unless morale is prioritized over efficiency. You shake your head. Even the wildest war plans must pass through the gate of paperwork. And in Canada's case, the gate was extremely well labeled, categorized, and filed. But not all of it made sense. You flip through one particularly dense bundle of pages marked Phase 4 Civil Management Considerations. This is where the plan starts pretending to be realistic. It includes discussions on what to do if Canadian troops encountered American civilians, how to issue temporary ID papers, how to administer basic services, and this is not a joke, how to accept American currency as an interim courtesy. It's war, but customer service must remain. Another section discusses emergency civil accommodations, suggesting that commandeered American homes should be used sparingly and always with minimal disruption to personal belongings. One officer even proposed printing thank you cards.
You imagine now a soldier nervously handing a card to a baffled homeowner. Dear Sir, Madam, thank you for allowing us to temporarily occupy your breakfast nook during Operation Strategic Forward Maneuver. Your cooperation has been noted. Warmest regards, the 3rd Royal Manitoba Light Infantry. And of course, there were maps. So many maps. Topographic charts, road atlases, hand-drawn town layouts. One particularly fragile copy of a 1921 Vermont Railroad Guide included annotations like ideal bridge for temporary delay and susceptible to controlled demolition, weather permitting. Another marked with an ominous red X simply read, "Do not attempt unless no other choice." You imagine 2 junior officers arguing over that very bridge. One insists the detour is manageable. The other just doesn't want to blow up anything that pretty. Someone writes it into the plan. The debate ends with both agreeing to revisit it in committee. This was the heart of the operation, a giant stack of what-ifs and if-thens and maybe but only ifs, layered in paper, bound by staples, and probably held together with a fair amount of guesswork. But make no mistake, it was all treated with absolute seriousness. Because even if no one wanted this war, someone still had to figure out whether a supply mule could carry enough beans to get through upstate New York. The irony, much of this plan likely would have failed in execution, not from a lack of courage or intent, but from sheer impracticality. Roads misjudged, weather miscalculated, timetables over-optimistic, and of course, the endless unknowns of facing a vastly larger American military response. Yet, there's a quiet kind of heroism in that too. These officers, most of them veterans of the Great War, weren't writing fantasy novels. They were preparing for the unthinkable. They didn't know how long peace would last, so they filed the memos, drew the maps, argued about bicycle tires, because someone had to. And you, seated now in the dusty stillness of this imagined archive, realize that none of this is dramatic, none of it is explosive, it's just preparation. Tedious, meticulous, slightly ridiculous preparation. And yet it may have saved lives, if only by giving Canada the confidence to know, quietly, that it could respond should things ever turn. You close the folder, brush off the dust, and realize that you've just read 1,000 pages of just in case. And that, in its own sleepy way, is kind of beautiful.
You lean back now, letting the snow settle gently on your shoulders as you drift into the warm fuzziness of a what-if. Because it never happened. Not one bridge blown, Not one polite leaflet handed out, not one pair of wool socks abandoned in retreat. The maps were folded, the plans filed, and the war stayed safely in the world of imagination. But what if it hadn't? Close your eyes. Let's walk into that alternate world for a while. One where defense scheme number 1 is activated. Not a drill, not a test, the real thing. Let's say it starts in February 1925. A diplomatic spat spirals. Maybe it's a trade war. Maybe it's something about British naval exercises. Maybe somebody misreads a telegraph. Or a junior officer in Montana fires one shot too many. Whatever the spark, it's enough. The Canadian High Command meets in Ottawa and gives the word, initiate scheme number 1. And just like that, you're drafted into the Maple Militia. Your orders are clear. You're part of the Eastern Detachment. You'll cross the border near the Richelieu River under cover of darkness, make your way into New York State, sabotage a key railway line, and withdraw before sunrise. Should take, 12 hours? Maybe 15. You pack extra snacks, just in case. You're issued a uniform that smells faintly of mothballs and burnt coffee. Your rifle is reliable, if a little clunky. Your commanding officer is nervous, but determined. He spent the last 2 years poring over maps and contingency memos, and now he's clutching them like sacred scrolls. You cross into America on foot, the snow crunching under your boots. A dog barks in the distance. The wind carries a faint scent of wood smoke. The town of Rouse's Point is quiet. A few porch lights burn low. You pass a local diner where a sleepy teenager wipes down the counter. None of them suspect you're here. None of them know they've just been invaded. You reach the railway line just before 2 a.m. Your demolition team gets to work. It's clumsy, cold, and loud. You hold your breath every time a hammer strikes metal. But the charges are set, the countdown started, and you move back into the tree line just in time to see the rail buckle with a metallic groan. The retreat is slower. The snow is heavier now. American soldiers are waking up to reports of unusual activity. You hear the distant roar of an engine, maybe a Model T, maybe a truck, and you pick up the pace. By dawn, you're back across the border, boots soaked, heart thudding, hands trembling from adrenaline and cold. You did it. A clean operation. Nobody dead. The kind of small, strategic disruption the plan was designed for. But now the real waiting begins. Because you're not alone. As you dry your boots by a makeshift stove, other reports filter in. Seattle's rail yard was damaged. A depot in Fargo went up in flames. Albany saw brief fighting in the streets. American border patrols were caught completely off guard. And the leaflets? Oh yes, they were dropped. This is not a hostile act, they said. Canada remains committed to peace. The United States government, understandably, disagrees. Within hours, headlines blare. Canada invades. Maple Leaf March. Bridges blown, border breached. In Washington, there's disbelief, then fury. Emergency meetings are held. War Plan Red is dusted off, read aloud in rooms where no one is sleeping. Troop mobilizations begin. You, meanwhile, are reassigned. You're now part of the 3rd Defensive Regiment, stationed along the Quebec border. Your job is to dig trenches, reinforce bridges, and stare south into the trees, waiting for the retaliation. And it comes. Within a week, American forces sweep northward through Maine and Vermont. Skirmishes erupt. Canadian units retreat slowly, executing the fallback phases mapped years ago. Halifax is under threat. Civilians flee inland. The international press goes wild. Britain hesitates. The League of Nations flaps its diplomatic arms. Somewhere in the Atlantic, a British cruiser changes course, but too slowly to matter just yet. Your world is now one of cold camps, cautious firewood rations, and muddy boots. You eat from dented tins, sleep in bursts, and dream about railway sabotage like some kind of oddly specific recurring nightmare. And yet, you're alive. And, against all odds, Canada holds. For a few weeks. Because this alternate war is not a long one. It can't be. The U.S. is bigger, richer, faster. Within a month, most major Canadian cities near the border are under pressure. Ottawa, realizing the scale of what's coming, sues for peace. Britain, scrambling for plausible deniability, supports a ceasefire. The Americans agree, but only after key rail lines are restored and security guarantees are established. And so the war ends almost as quietly as it began. You return home with your gear, your memories, and a story so strange no one quite believes it. You invaded the U.S. with what? Snowshoes and a warning note? You nod. Yes, that's exactly what it was. And eventually, like all strange history, it gets filed away, relegated to memoirs and a few dusty textbooks, until decades later, a documentary surfaces, then a novel, then a bedtime podcast episode. And tonight, here we are, not at war, not marching, just imagining, just remembering the war that almost, but never, happened, and the version of you that marched to Albany in a flannel coat, he's long since gone back to bed.
You're walking now through time, not snow. The year is 1974. A new government archivist, bright-eyed, perhaps a little too enthusiastic, unlocks a drawer in Ottawa, digs through the usual boring military files, and finds something very odd. Maps, sketches, notes, leaflets that were never printed, a whole invasion plan, drawn with the quiet confidence of someone who absolutely expected to ride into Vermont on horseback and apologize for the inconvenience. It takes a moment to sink in. Canada had a secret plan to invade the United States. And it wasn't a joke. That archivist does what archivists do. Files are reviewed, historians are called. Eventually, someone decides, this isn't dangerous anymore. It's history. Weird, forgotten, and oddly gentle history. So the story is made public. For the first time in over 50 years,
Canadians learned that their military once wrote up a strategy to sabotage Minneapolis and retreat through backroads before the Americans could get organized. And the national reaction? A long pause, then a collective chuckle, because it's so Canadian in its absurdity. Wait, we plan to invade them? Only briefly. And then leave? Yes. With leaflets? Very polite ones. You imagine the moment this story breaks on Canadian evening news. Anchormen raise their eyebrows and grin. Political cartoonists have a field day. One drawing features a moose with a rifle slung over its shoulder, politely knocking on the White House door. Another shows Mounties tiptoeing through Michigan, leaving thank you notes and footprints in the snow. Meanwhile, Americans react with a mixture of disbelief and delight. Some express genuine surprise that their northern neighbor ever considered war. Others just shrug and say, well, we'd probably still win. Which, yes, let's be honest. The U.S. military, even in the 1920s, was a colossus compared to Canada's modest forces. But that's not the point. The point is that it almost happened. That both countries, so friendly for so long, once quietly prepared to throw snowballs at each other in the dark. And what do Canadians do with that knowledge? They make it folklore. Defense Scheme Number 1 becomes the kind of trivia you bring up at parties. High school teachers mention it on sleepy Friday afternoons. CBC runs a 2-part special with dramatic reenactments and an actor in a 1920s uniform pointing at a very serious map. Even some local theaters stage historical comedies inspired by it. Titles like The Apologetic Invasion and Oops, We Took Albany become surprise hits at fringe festivals. You smile because this is how Canada processes its military history, with gentle laughter, a bit of disbelief, and a quiet sense of relief that it all stayed on paper. Still, there are lessons tucked beneath the humor. The release of Defense Scheme Number 1 prompts real conversations about Canadian sovereignty, military planning, and the post-World War I paranoia that shaped so many nations. Historians dive in, tracing the geopolitical anxieties of the time, comparing Canada's plan to War Plan Red, and pointing out how closely those hypothetical wars danced near the edge of absurdity. One 1975 editorial in the Globe and Mail sums it up best. It was never about wanting war. It was about fearing silence. And that's what you carry with you now, as you wander through this long, odd tale's final stretch. Because behind all the wool coats, icy roads, and leaflets, there was a truth as old as conflict itself. Even peaceful nations sometimes prepare for the worst. Not because they expect it, but because they can't afford not to.
The quiet irony, all that planning, all that secrecy, and not one shot fired. Not one soldier marched. Not one bridge blown. And thank goodness. So here it sits today, half myth, half memory. Not taught in every textbook, but not exactly hidden either. A tiny war plan for a war that never came, drawn up in quiet rooms, whispered over snowy maps, filed away and, for a while, forgotten. But not anymore. Tonight, you've walked its length. You've met the people who made it, the places it touched, the pages it filled. And though it's strange and sleepy and slightly ridiculous, it's yours now too. A story to keep beside your pillow,
one to pass along with a smile. And if nothing else, the next time someone asks, "What's the weirdest thing Canada ever did?" you'll know. So now, as the last echoes of marching boots fade into the hush of snowy forests, you find yourself far from battlefields. No more maps, no more invasion routes, just the gentle hush of a world that almost shifted but didn't. The stars above Vermont twinkle just as they did in 1921. Quiet towns still sleep along the border, unconcerned with schemes once scrawled in dusty offices 100 years ago. And you, still wrapped in your blanket, eyes growing heavy, can rest knowing that even the most improbable plans, even the frost-bitten dreams of war, can melt away with time. Let your thoughts drift now, not to strategy or sabotage, but to softer things. The creak of a sled on fresh snow, the whistle of a kettle on a wood stove, the distant hoot of an owl perched high in a pine. Canada never marched into Albany. The leaflets were never printed. The bridges still stand. And somewhere in an archive, the whole plan sleeps soundly in a drawer, gathering dust, just as it should. You've wandered through history tonight, not with fear, but with curiosity, not to fight, but to understand. So take a breath. Let the past settle. You've earned your rest. Good night, gentle traveler.